having children and creating a family that way is basically signing on to a lifelong, never-ending group activity. And as somebody who just doesn't really do well in groups and who is actually very happy and most content, either on my own or in sort of one-to-one situations with close and trusted companions, like my husband, who I've been with for 24 years, happily married, and neither of us wanted to have children, thankfully, because that can be something else that's very difficult to navigate. What I realized, and of course, this is part of the reason I drank the way I did.
I dreamt that you were twisted through 7. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Sober Fool podcast. Guys, at last, we've got her. We have got Ruby Warrington on the Sober Fool podcast. We were just chatting before, like, I can't believe that we haven't had a conversation yet. It just seems crazy. Welcome, Ruby.
Thanks so much for having me, Veronica. It's amazing to meet you.
Yeah.
After, having known so much about you and your work, and our names just been sort of, mentioned in so many of the similar places. So it's really great to be here.
Same here. Yeah, I've really followed your work and loved what you've done. So for those of you who don't know, Ruby is a British-born editor, author and podcaster, and the founder of Numinous Books. Now, my audience will know you from having written Sober Curious and the Sober Curious Reset, amongst other books, which I just... your bio here describes you as a thought leader, and that's really, so two things. Sober Curious was a book that needed to be written. And the new book that we're here to talk about, Women Without Kids, just feels like a book that needed to be written, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. And it's funny, it's not like I sit here at my desk twiddling my thumbs going, what's the thing that people aren't talking about? Where do we need to go next? Both of these books were born from a very personal place of not necessarily need, but a personal place of fascination and a personal place of, yes, actually, I need to know, I need to get to the roots of this thing that's present in my world, And with Sober Curious, I needed to get to the roots of my relationship with alcohol, and I wasn't able to find my answers in the rooms of AA and traditional recovery spaces. I needed a different approach, and so Sober Curious was born out of that. And with Women Without Kids, I needed to know once and for all, why have I never wanted to be a mother? Because it's a question that has hounded me my entire life. I have always confidently known I didn't want to be a mother. And I've always questioned why that is, until I really was able to get to the root of it. This manifested in quite a lot of shame, this knowing about myself, what feels like a very true path for me, did manifest in a lot of feelings of, well, there's just something wrong with me, which again sort of dovetails with, many people's experiences of, why do I drink the way I do? Well, there's just something wrong with me. And when we get to the real root of that question, the real answer of that question, we realize there's nothing wrong with us. Our circumstances, which can cover all sorts of different things, have led to us drinking the way we do. My circumstances led to me not wanting to be a mother, And so understanding that, there's such a dissolution of shame, and there's so much potential then to kind of move beyond that questioning and into just living, So I came to this project needing to know once and for all, because I had been asked by so many other people as well, why did I not want to be a mother? And then actually the scope of the project widened out significantly when I then sort of turned my journalistic eye to it and noticed that actually the birth rate has been declining steeply for at least the past century. Wow. Reflecting, and this is globally as well, but reflecting millions and millions and millions of women's individual choices not to become parents or to have far fewer children than they might have done in previous sort of times, I suppose. So I was just really interested in looking at why did I never want to become a mother? And then why, on a broadest level, I suppose, why have we stopped having children? Like, why are we having far fewer children and many more of us having no children at all? And so that was the kind of launching off point for this project, which, it's gutted me, but in really important ways, you know, getting to the weeds of those two questions has uncovered so much deep wounding and deep healing that is needed in this area.
There's so much to unpack here, because from the parts that I've read in the book, I mean, there's just all of the patriarchal expectations and how women are perceived. I was just talking to a client yesterday, actually, who's just turned 60 and is experiencing ageism in her work. And I said, we were talking about how women get this at least twice, right? If you're a woman without children in your 30s, your employer's kind of like, oh, she's great, but are we going to lose her because she's just going to go and have kids, right? And then maybe in your 40s you're kind of all right, and then in your 50s it's like, oh, now she's going through the menopause, and so there's so much to unpack there. There's lots to unpack about our own relationships with mothers, and I was reading that part just before we were talking about when your own mother spoke to you about her relationship. It felt different when you were born to when your brother was born. The sacrifices, all of that kind of stuff. I'm just trying to, I made some notes. And one of the things that really stood out for me, because I came to motherhood late, I have 2 kids. I never had the baby hunger. I never experienced it. I was always like, yeah, someday that's going to happen. That's just, I'll do that. And I got to 37. It's like, well, now then. And I was very lucky that I got pregnant. And I had my second at 42 with IVF straight away. So I never experienced any of that a lot of women go through. And I always wonder, every so often I sort of think, I wonder what my life would have been like if I hadn't, would I have gone through years of longing and IVF or whatever, or all that kind of stuff. And one of the things that really stuck out, what you said, is about being an introvert and just the luxury of time and space and not being bothered, and how important that was for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my research did throw up that extroverts tend to have more children, which makes sense.
Right.
And this is, I think, one of the reasons why AA and recovery groups never really spoke to me. I'm such a loner. I'm just not a group activities person. And, we could pick that apart and say, well, what's wrong with me? But then again, like, why does that mean there has to be something wrong with me?
Exactly.
Can't that just be my personality?
Yeah.
This came up in a conversation yesterday. I'm like, having a family, having children and creating a family that way is basically signing on to a lifelong, never-ending group activity. And as somebody who just doesn't really do well in groups and who is actually very happy and most content, either on my own or in sort of one-to-one situations with close and trusted companions, like my husband, who I've been with for 24 years, happily married. And, neither of us wanted to have children, thankfully, because that can be something else that's very difficult to navigate.
Yeah.
And you described the having alone time as a luxury. For me, that's one of those luxuries that's actually really vital to my well-being, mental and emotional well-being. I'm incredibly, what I realized, and of course this is part of the reason I drank the way I did, I'm incredibly sensitive to stress. And we might say, well, everybody's sensitive to stress, but actually I believe that some people are more resilient to external stresses than others. Some people are just more quote unquote sensitive. I've been thinking about how there's this concept of dandelion children and orchid children. Is that it? There are some kids kind of will thrive in any environment they find themselves in. They're dandelion children. Right. And then there are orchid children who actually need quite specific conditions to thrive, or they will find it really difficult. And it's not to say that anyone is better than the other. But I think that I'm incredibly sensitive to stress. I'm incredibly sensitive to external stimulus. And that's one of the reasons why I need alone time. I describe my hours of aloneness in the book as cleansing hours of silence. I absorb a hell of a lot from my external environment. I'm an empath, basically. It's definitely one of the major reasons I drank was to prevent myself from feeling all of the impact of all of this external stimulus, even though it wasn't preventing the external stimulus from affecting me, which is then manifested in terrible hangovers. but yeah, I think that was a really important thing for me to acknowledge and to say, and that's okay. That's okay. I might need more hours of alone time than many people would think is healthy. I might need more quote unquote me time that many people might think is selfish, but that's what I need, and that's okay, you know?
I'm just thinking as you're talking how you would have coped just a few decades earlier, or how many women like you who, I mean, they're just, I mean, I think even now there's a lot of massive prejudice against women without children, but 50 years ago, 100 years ago, I mean, I guess that's...
it's interesting. My paternal grandmother, who I didn't really have much of a relationship with, she had her own sort of mental health issues that manifested in her being very withdrawn, and I just didn't really have any relationship with her, but I share a strong genetic imprint with her. I look a lot like her. And she, as my aunt shared with me, she was, as my aunt, her daughter, described, a mother's little helper mother. She was taking Valium throughout her entire, daily, throughout her entire experience of mothering. Valium is alcohol in pill form, basically. I think that I possibly would have been that sort of a mother, if prior to the advent of safe, reliable birth control, prior to the advent of safe, legal abortion, prior to women in the mainstream having access to education, prior to equal opportunities in the workplace, when motherhood really was definitely not the only option. And there have been outliers. There have been women without kids throughout history. But had I not really seen another option for myself but motherhood, I do think I would have struggled in that role.
Yeah, I'm sure that's why nunneries are dying out. I'm sure that's one of the reasons for many women. That was solitude and escape and heaven.
I hadn't even thought about it. You're absolutely right. Yes.
And I think for a lot of women who just were like, oh God, no.
That's not for me. Yeah. But then, of course, the only alternative option was to dedicate your life in service to Jesus. There was still this expectation that your life must therefore be dedicated in service to someone else.
So there's going to be a little bit of swearing because
okay.
Tell me what
was of course there is. Oh my God.
The book's called Women Without Kids. What was the title you wanted?
Okay, so the original title that came through, and it really did. It was really just like, I describe it in the book as if I downloaded it from a vending machine in the sky. It just kind of like chick-ka-ching. The original title was Selfish Cunt. I'm glad you're laughing, and I'm glad you brought it up. I really grappled with it. I wanted to use this title so badly, but partly because
You're in America, that would never have worked.
No, in America, no. Exactly. For marketing purposes, it seemed very clear that, okay, although, and again, I make the point in the book, there was a time there where if you put the F word, the word fuck in your book title, you were pretty much guaranteed a bestseller, but we still have serious issues with the C word, which I think just speaks to how much pain, fear, loathing, unprocessed sort of trauma there is in the realm of female sexuality. And I think that the fact that women have been so often sort of, it's not even forced into motherhood, but that has been the only option, that has been the only way to express, the only kind of valid way to express our sexuality as women, is to use it in service of creating more human beings, is, I don't know, it's just all kind of wrapped up in our feelings, the visceral response almost that we have to that word cunt, which is ultimately just a word for a part of the female body, but it's so loaded. And of course, selfish cunt, like truly it came through as we as women need to reclaim both these words, because they are both weaponized against us and used to keep us living within very narrow boundaries about what our lives should actually look like.
Something you were just saying, and this is a controversial subject, is there are some people who should never be parents.
It is controversial to say that. And it's true. Yeah, I think it's true. And not because they're bad people, but because not everybody is suited to what is actually a very specific, I've heard it described as a vocation. that's just like not everybody is suited to be a writer, it's like parenting is a vocation. Just because we have the biological capacity to become parents, most of us, and obviously given the number of people who are experiencing fertility issues now, that's by no means a given, does not mean that we should become parents, especially given that the conditions under which we do our parenting in sort of, individualistic, westernized, consumerist cultures, where there's very little support beyond the kind of, immediate family, nucleus of the immediate kind of family. Parenting is by no means easy. It requires a specific skill set to be able to comfortably and reliably perform that role, let alone the material resource to be able to do so. And I'm not saying by any means that people who are poor shouldn't have children, for example. If anything, if more people were supported financially by policies which enabled them to be parents, then, that would be the ideal outcome. But yeah, I talk a lot about the concept of parental readiness and how actually it's sort of irresponsible to just go ahead and procreate without considering your parental readiness. Irresponsible towards yourself and how you might be impacted, but also towards any children you might bring onto the planet who you will ultimately be pretty much responsible for until at least their kind of late teens, The thing is, becoming a parent is a life or death irreversible decision. It's probably the biggest decision that anybody can make. And it just seems very antiquated to think about it in the terms of, well, this is every woman's rightful role. Because you're able to birth life, that must be what you're here to do. It just seems like we need some really new thinking around that.
100%. One of the things that's always driven me crazy, and I love being a mother. I absolutely love it. And I feel very, very, very blessed that I was able to have two healthy children relatively late. I mean, right at the finishing line, really. I mean, I do feel for poor Jennifer Aniston and having 30 years of relentless. I mean, I can't imagine that poor woman. She must have she's obviously worked on herself. And I
yes,
right. And she only the other week she came out and said, she's never really sort of spoken about it. She said, I did a lot of things. I did IVF. It didn't work. One of the things that I've always hated is that if you're a mother, your value and just, I think it's only just now with your book and just other things that are happening that it's women have value regardless. And you say in your book at the end, like for you, I loved how you said this, you have ideas and projects that don't let you go. And you have to give to that because you're just built that way. And I have the same, and I'm very aware of how much I have to give to that and how much I have to give to other things. But for you to have to do that, but also it's not that just women have stuff to give, ideas and art and whatever, but just being yourself is enough. Just being out there, being yourself. And we know that men without kids do not have anything like the same.
No.
And I want to get to the point where women are all valued regardless, of whether they're mothers or not. And I don't think we're there yet.
We're not there yet. We're not. Depending. I mean, I spent the past 10 years living in New York City, which is a city which attracts, I think, women who are confidently looking for a place, looking to be in a place where this isn't questioned, where their value is not only seen in their role as mother. But then oftentimes, your value must be in your career then. If you don't have a big, fabulous career to make up for the fact you haven't become a mother, then you have still failed, And so, I think this idea you're getting at, which is like, we don't need to produce anything in the world to prove or to kind of to validate our existence, to prove our worthiness, almost to kind of pay our rent for taking up space on the planet. It's like, how about just being is enough, it's a concept that, I think we're really being tasked with looking at as we grapple with the kind of the pressures of late stage capitalism to sort of, see ourselves almost as dispensable kind of units of energetic energy. You know, if we're not contributing something into the machine, then we're just kind of superfluous in a way. To sort of take it that way. One thing I really want to make clear is that in no way, shape or form with this book am I encouraging anyone not to have children. I'm not saying being child-free is fabulous. This is a wonderful lifestyle choice. Not at all. What I'm saying is, what's a wonderful lifestyle choice is a life where you can really, truly know yourself and where you're empowered and supported in living a life that really suits you and allows you to kind of like exist as your most authentic self, you know? And so that's kind of what I'm getting at. Within that, there is some work that needs to be done around saying non-motherhood is equally as valid as motherhood. Because that's the missing piece currently. It is still very much, you know, if you're not a mother, then something is missing. You have failed on some level, and either poor you, how awful for you, or, well, you know, selfish cunt.
No, that was very clear.
Yeah.
Can I ask about your relationship with your mother and how that shaped you and your idea of, so you did you have at certain points like, ooh, I think I remember reading that, like, oh, maybe we should,
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think because the cultural narrative around this is the most important thing you'll ever do, you'll never experience true love or true depth of love if you don't have a child. The big one, you might not feel it now, but you will regret it if you don't do this. And then the really big one for me, who will look after you when you're old? Which I think might be the second book following from this. But anyway, there's a whole conversation to be had around that. But these are very big kind of unspoken and unspoken sort of beliefs that we have around parenthood and around motherhood in particular. And so, of course, I took all of that on board. And like I said at the beginning, despite always confidently, and when I say confidently, I mean my intuition around this was always stronger and an anchor for me in the midst of a lot of kind of questioning and a lot of self-doubt. I could always come back to my intuition, which was just like, it's a no. Motherhood is a no. You know, that was just, it's intuition for people who are familiar with working with their intuition. It's subtle but powerful. And it's enough. When we can hear it, it's enough. No matter how much questioning we might be doing mentally or other people might be questioning us. So my intuition was always really strong, but the questioning I went through, I was almost able to talk myself into it a couple of times, you know, and came really close around the age. I think it was 2013. So I just turned like 38 or 38 or something. So around that age that you realized, oh wait, now's the time. I had a moment of like, okay, this is it now. We're at the edge of the cliff. Like this is the time to just jump and hope parachute works. You know,
it all works out.
And of course, on one drunken night, kind of really came out of it, just like having completely talked myself into it. Like we should just do it. Like seriously, we're great together. We have a great relationship. Like I'm sure we can overcome whatever obstacles there will be. It'll be an incredible adventure. Like one life, like YOLO, let's just go for it. But then it wasn't immediately the next day, the idea dissipated, but it was kind of over the next few days and couple of weeks, it just sort of was a reality bit again. And it was like, no, this just it's not right. You know, if I'm having to talk myself into it to that degree, this just isn't right. And I think that was the last real kind of push I had around it. But then it was when I sort of came into my early 40s and started looking ahead to menopause and really contemplating the cessation of my biological clock ticking away, that I realized I had no regrets. Absolutely nothing was missing from my life. You know, I was doing all the things I wanted to do. I felt completely fulfilled. I had experienced deep, true love with my husband, with my friends, and actually coming out of my drinking and into this sober space. And when I say sober space, I mean like internally, in my head, in my heart, in my body, this sober space of being able to actually really look at a lot of the reasons I had been drinking, I mean, so much of that was connected to how I felt about my family of origin, my relationship with my parents, as it is for so many of us.
Yes.
I mean, I am very intrigued by the work of ACA, Adult Children of Alcoholics, which is essentially all about family dysfunction. And I think a lot of people come to that place having quit drinking, having got sober and realized that, this has been a lot of compensating or a lot of running from some of the really deep kind of wounding that's a result of being raised in the family I was raised in. All of that said, I didn't experience major childhood trauma. My parents are very loving, supportive people. There were just a lot of challenges, that made it difficult. And so, I write about all of this in chapter 8, which is the one you touched on before. I don't really want to go into it here. I've written about it in a way that my mother is happy with. We went backwards and forwards a lot on that chapter. She provided plenty of notes. And so it's presented there in a way that I feel comfortable sharing about. I suppose what I'm saying is that the same realization, nothing's missing. I have no regrets. I didn't miss out. This has been the right path for me, came with a realization I have a lot of work to do around healing my relationship with my mother. And in fact, I think if I had had a child before I'd done what has been an incredible deep healing with my mum, writing this book being part of that, I would have imprinted those same wounds into my relationship with my children.
Because I think 100%, that's what happens.
Like if we don't work out our wounding, we will imprint it into the future generation for them to work out. That's kind of how it works. And so, I know that I had to do the healing work before I could even contemplate having a child. I couldn't do the healing work until I quit drinking. And none of that happened until my late 30s, early 40s, by which point it was too late. I have considered if that had all happened in my late 20s, would things have gone differently? Possibly. But, as you were contemplating, would my life have been different if I hadn't had children? Yes, of course. But this is the life we're living. Ultimately, where I come to in that chapter is there's a whole long section about acceptance. And how important that is when considering, well, even that, that projection, which is so coercive and manipulative, that you'll regret not having children. You might not think it's worth it now. You might not be feeling it now, but you will regret it. Contemplating the concept of regret, acceptance goes hand in hand with that, because I think whatever path we take, there's always the potential for regret, and the more we can accept, this is me, this is my path, this is my life, this is how it is, which sobriety forces us to do when we're able to really engage with it. The more we can, hopefully find some gratitude for what we do have, some appreciation for the life we have been given,
So there's lots of things I wanted to pick up on.
Yes, sorry, I was a bit of a monologue.
Right. That's fine. I'd rather you talk to me. One of the things that it seems like this book helped you do is figure out the internal and the external pressure, because there is such massive external pressure. And the internal, you said, you just kept going back to your intuition, which was a very firm no. But the external pressure, and again, the parallels are with alcohol, right? Is the internal, totally. Knowing, I don't want to be like this, but the constant external from peers, from media, from absolutely everywhere, relentless pressure that everyone drinks. You should drink. That's how we have fun. You're a woman in your 30s. You should get pregnant. That's what we do. It's really it's a real, I always say that sobriety it's basically a journey back to ourselves. It's back to our authentic self, and really being able to trust that. And we can really get lost in the external world. We can get really lost in the shoulds and what other people think and all of that kind of stuff. And then the other thing that you were saying that's very, very true, I mean, I was a psychotherapist in the UK, is every generation is given an invitation to heal the trauma and the wounds of the previous ones. And if you don't take it, it will just be passed on. And I've been thinking about this a lot in terms of my own journey and raising kids about, I think adulthood, especially young adulthood, so much of it is about understanding ourselves and our family of origin. And, I was 10 years sober when I had my first child. And I remember a client saying to me, oh my gosh, you're such a great mom. You know so much about emotional intelligence. And I had this kind of like, yeah, I do. Yeah.
I got this.
and then when he was 2, I found myself being my mother, which was the opposite of how I wanted to parent. One of the most revealing questions that we ask as therapists, it's like one of our tricks, is if you have kids or if you imagine you're a parent, how would you do things differently? And that just opens up like so much.
Yes.
Yes. And I was thinking just the other day of how many mistakes I've made and the things I regret and I wish I'd done differently. And kind of I'm coming to this place where I'm like, I can't, I'm going to keep doing stuff. And I know I'm good enough. I absolutely know I'm a good enough mum. And I got to equip them with the tools to work out the stuff that wasn't helpful.
Right. Well, I think this is it strikes me that you can do all the self-work and get clear on all your patterns. And there's something about the act of becoming a parent that is going to trigger them, regardless of how much you've worked all that stuff out, regardless of how much you know your dysfunction. It will be triggered in that dynamic. I think the difference in what you're describing is that you're able to be conscious of that and sort of notice it happening, which is, the difference between, I suppose, conscious parenting and unconscious parenting. And I think that, and I do write about this in the book as well, my mother was a conscious parent. She did so much of her healing work in her parenting of my brother and I. And I feel like the recipient of that. There's a part of me that almost believes like she healed so much. There was no need for me to have another child to heal that stuff with our shared kind of like family wounding, which gets pretty deep. But yeah, the book is quite deep. I wrote it during the pandemic, and it just, I decided to just really go for it. I'm like, there's no point doing this by halves. I'm really going to put maybe some of my more out there theories into the book and just sort of present them as possibilities for people to consider and hopefully to start some new conversations around this whole subject,
I also loved what you were saying about menopause, because we're similar. I just turned 50. So we're Generation X, right?
Yes.
Very Gen X.
And very Gen X. I'm proud.
Yeah. So I have a theory before I start the one about menopause, is I feel the role Gen X has in our culture is to talk about the elephant in the room. So if you remember back in the 90s when, like, for instance, the Spice Girls all got pregnant and were very, very publicly pregnant, that wasn't a thing. I mean, I think maybe Demi Moore on the cover of Vanity Fair, Madonna, up until that point, celebrity famous women just went off and did that and maybe came back, but they weren't publicly pregnant. So that was a Gen X thing. I think the same thing about lots of stages of womanhood, but now menopause. If you notice, Davina McCall, Meg Matthews, etc., a lot of the conversations about, like, we are now finally publicly talking about menopause, and we weren't 10 years ago, I don't think. No. It's all Gen X. That's the role Gen X has, is to talk about the elephant in the room.
So here's my theory on this.
Go on.
Gen X women are the daughters of the women's liberation movement.
Yes.
We were the first generation of women to have been born. So this is women who were born from, the late maybe 1960s through kind of like the end of the 1970s, that decade. We were the first generation of women to be born with the message going into our ears: you can do, be, want, have whatever you want. Being a woman is not going to hold you back from having what you want in this life. Like, literally the first. Yeah. And so, I do think the fact that we've sort of overturned so many conventions in terms of what it means to be a woman, is due to that, honestly. Prior to this, I mean, women had better toe the line, or there'll be consequences, and there just weren't the same opportunities. Now, also, not all women have benefited from that message. Not all women have been afforded opportunities to really have autonomy over our lives in equal measure. And that's the work that the feminist movement still has to do, is ensure equity for all women globally. not to sound too grandiose, but seriously, this is the work that we're tasked with as feminists.
That's
I suppose
how we can use our privilege.
Exactly. And so, and I note that, Gen X was a sort of a tipping point for womankind in many ways because of the work that our mothers and our mothers' mothers in the first and second waves of feminism did to kind of really push and agitate for change. We're the recipients of that. And I do think we have a responsibility to sort of pay that forward. And I think being vocal about these sorts of issues is part of that, I think that menopause is having a massive rebrand as we speak. I've got a podcast going out this Sunday with Stacey London, who is a TV presenter here in the US, who's become something of a menopause advocate. I think midlife is being completely redefined. And I think aging as a woman with or without kids is going to look very different in the future, but it will require us to be vocal, to push back against convention, to continually do the uncomfortable work, which we get comfortable with in sobriety, of going against the grain, going against convention, being the awkward one, standing up for what we want and need versus what society would want for us, I do feel really privileged to be part of Generation X. And it's very interesting to me to see how the, millennials and Gen Zs in particular are expressing ambivalence about becoming mothers in much, much greater numbers. And I sort of feel like we have given them permission in a way and are continuing to give them permission to question whether this is the path for them. And rightly so, not as a rejection of motherhood, but just as a realistic assessment of what it actually takes to be a parent and our capacity to do that job.
Yeah. And we're both British and we live in America. There's for all America does is promoting family values. There's nothing about American culture that supports you having a family whatsoever. It's
absolutely
really hard.
And at the same time, it's an incredibly individualistic economy. It's a survival of the fittest economy is how I describe it. There's very little provision for caregiving. Caregiving professions, including the caregiving vocation of motherhood, are massively devalued economically in this country. And so we have this very, like I said, survival of the fittest kind of lifestyle that has attached to it an incredibly sentimentalized sort of emphasis on home and family as being like, family values are what it's all in service of, and just feels so hypocritical. And I think there was, I was, on Instagram for International Women's Day, and that was the message that was coming through on my feed. People are sick of the hypocrisy of saying, we support and empower women, but we won't give them any paid parental leave. We won't give them free healthcare. We won't give subsidized childcare. It's just like, it's bullshit. Oh, and also we won't even let them have safe abortions now.
I like that the Gen Z, like it's the Parkland kids from the Parkland shooting in Florida were the ones who were fuck your thoughts and prayers, fuck them. Not interested.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
But I'm also fascinated so the other thing I've heard about Gen X, and it's in a book called, I think it's called Why Women Can't Sleep, and it's about Gen X women. And the author describes Gen X women as men and women raised with benign neglect. Right?
Interesting.
We were raised with benign neglect. We were the generation, off we went in the summer holidays, we came back when we were hungry, nobody knew where we were. And now we all have trackers on our children. I know exactly where they are. I can see them. But I'm really interested in how the boomers raised Gen Z in the way that we've described, but Gen Z has raised Gen X has raised Gen Z.
Gen X, the boomers raised Gen X, and then Gen X has raised Gen Z.
Millennials and Gen Z, and that this is, you may not be as aware of this as I am, is it's described as bulldozer parenting, where parents are so over involved in everything, managing everything, clearing away all obstacles. And here is the most vital thing that I see. The biggest problem is stealing the struggle from their kids. And I think the most important thing that kids can have is to struggle.
Right. Because how else do you learn resiliency? How else do you learn passion even? You know, how else do you learn what you value if you're being drip fed a kind of constant stream of comfort? I mean, that's the other thing. And I think about this a lot. America in particular, and it sort of bleeds out to anywhere that's adopted American values, is addicted to comfort.
Yes.
You know, and that's a reaction in some ways to the fact that America was founded on such violent terms. You know, so many people who came to America, even as immigrants, there was a real struggle. They were fleeing war. They were fleeing, you know, bad conditions. And so they're fleeing poverty. They come to America from a place of struggle and to seek a degree of comfort. And then that has sort of gone, that goes too far. And then there's this almost addiction to comfort. I thought a lot about that while I was writing Sober Curious, just how so much of our reliance on alcohol and other numbing agents is because as a result of this addiction to comfort. And that I think gets to what you're talking about. Like some degree of discomfort, some degree of struggle is necessary for developing resilience, like I said, passion, I think, just kind of, a moral kind of compass, all of these sorts of things, you know?
I'm thinking, you know, I've just been thinking about what is it about Gen X parents? Because everything is is a reflection of what happened before, right? It's
an emotional inheritance I talk about. Like
how as parents, the big thing about what parents do, and I know I'm doing it, we all do it, is we're working through, just as you said, we're working through our own child. Like, I want my child to go to dance classes because I wasn't allowed to go to dance classes, regardless of the fact that the child couldn't care less about dance classes, you know.
I want the child to go to dance classes because I love dance class, even if they hate it.
And I'm like, what is it about Gen X that we were raised with benign neglect? You know, I left home at 16 years old. And when I went to university about 22. I just figured that all out. I did it myself. I just turned up with I just did it. Nobody took me, like I just did. And how opposite that is, and how I don't want that for my kids. But I just find that very interesting, this generation, these things that are getting worked out.
I feel like each generation sort of pushes back against and carries things on, often in unconscious ways, and then pushes back against things. It's kind of an evolutionary process. Something boomers were raised by Victorian parents who had very rigid, children are seen and not heard.
And so boomers actually
were the hippies of the 1960s. They were, you know, the kids who were like, no, we're going to do rock and roll and take acid and like do things our own way. That's boomers. And then they raised Generation X, as you say, with that, well, we're not going to be dictatorial like our Victorian grandparents. We're going to let them do whatever they want, which is what I'm reading as benign neglect, is sort of like, just do whatever you want, just be happy, you're good, which can seem
I think they were quite busy getting on with their own lives. I think they were quite getting on with their own lives. Off you go, come back, you know, maybe, I don't know.
And it'll be interesting to see, because it is, you know, it's the children of Gen X, the Gen Zs, who are pushing back in a big way, saying, no, I definitely don't want to be a parent. Perhaps we modelled freedom, you know, we modelled autonomy, we modelled do things the way you want to do them. And so they're really questioning, well, I know that having a child is going to limit my freedom and my autonomy. And but then I also think, you know, in terms of Gen Z being very vocal about not wanting to have children, this is kind of the demographic, similar with alcohol, the demographic who are just not even starting drinking in the first place, you know. They're kind of making very different decisions around parenting or expressing different ideas around whether they want to be a parent. I think that the climate piece is a huge part of that, you know, which will be really come to the fore over the next decade or so. I call it childless by climate change. You know, if you have childless by choice, childless not by choice, childless by circumstance, there's childless by climate change, which is, there's a real cohort of people in their kind of early 20s and late teens who were just, I could not contemplate bringing a child onto the planet because the planet's dying, which is tragic, but also, again, where we're at. And so what do we do with where we're at? You know, the answer is not to just, it'll all be fine. Just, keep the pleasures of parenting will override all the anxieties and the fears. And it'll probably all work out great. It's just not, that sort of attitude just doesn't really cut it, I don't think, for Gen Z.
It's a great book. What do you hope that people will get out of it?
My real hope is that it will spark conversations like this. I'm encouraging people to, read it with your non-mum friends so that you can kind of find some kind of community and support, again, akin to getting sober. It's really helpful to kind of be able to find and connect with people who've got similar experiences to you and dig into those experiences together. So read it with your non-mum friends, but read it with your mum friends so that you can better understand. I think I call it the mummy binary. There's this sort of false divide that we perceive between mums and non-mums, and I'd really love to start doing some work towards breaking that down and engendering more empathy for each other's and understanding for each other's experiences. Read it with your mum, like seriously, Imagine, and I say this from a place of having given my mum this manuscript, and the conversations that came out of her reading it have been incredibly painful, but incredibly necessary and very healing for our relationship. So that's been amazing. Read it with your partner. It's not a book to be read alone because it is such a conversation starter. Of course, you can read it on your own, but I pretty much guarantee there'll be plenty that you'll want to talk about. So read it in a book group,
It's so much more than just than not having kids. There's so much more to it. It's about, there's just so many layers to it. It's really, really interesting. And again, as a woman with kids, I found it fascinating. There was lots of things that really made me think. It's really framed really interestingly. Congratulations, Ruby. I think this is a book that really needed to be out there. So I think that lots of women are going to get lots out of that. Where can people find you if they want to connect?
So I'm currently fairly active on Instagram, which is at Ruby Warrington. I'm also, I have a website, rubywarrington.com, where I've got a retreat coming up, Women Without Kids retreat in the middle of June. So the information about that will be posted very shortly.
Oh, interesting.
Those are where there's also a Women Without Kids podcast. I actually recorded all the research interviews I did for the book, which are with social scientists, evolutionary biologists, therapists. I recorded them all as a podcast series. So that kind of gets really deep into how I researched this book and the fascinate. I had to save those conversations. They were just too good.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ruby. I'm so glad that you finally got here. Please come back. I feel like there's more we could talk about. So please come back down the road.
Absolutely. And I know our paths will cross again. So it's really nice to finally meet you properly.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you.